Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I read a really interesting column in the Globe and Mail recently. Maxwell Cameron was the author. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. And he wrote an article that suggested it was going to be a really good idea to have a charter challenge of our first past the post electoral system, and that he said it could lead to a better electoral system. I think that the quote that I heard is that our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, 1,500 times during his first election said it was going to be the last election under the first past the post. And surprise, surprise, things didn't change afterwards. And Max, Professor Dr. Cameron, I should say, we live in an era of democratic backsliding, you say, and the threats of autocratization. I haven't heard that before. Autocratization. I love that word. I presume that's autocrats that are taking over. You referenced the attempted constitutional coup by Trump on January the 6th, 2 years ago, is one example, but another was the effort in Canada by the Freedom Convoy to disrupt Canada's constitutional order. I also think that, frankly, some of the recent elections are other examples where in Ontario, we got a majority government via Doug Ford winning 40% of the electorate, but only 40% turned out. And so you do the math, it's, only less than 20% of the people actually voted for a person who has a mandate to run the government. And that conservative vote, based on the numbers I've seen, counted as 10 times more powerful than a Liberal vote in regards to actually electing MPs. And a NDP vote counted 6 times more powerful than a Liberal vote. So it took 6 times as many Liberals voters to elect an MP as it did for an NDP. It took 10 times more Liberals to vote as it did for a Conservative to elect for an MP, which is just one of the strange things about a first past the post. Anyway, Dr. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your article. Tell me, what's your argument?
Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you for inviting me, and please call me Max. This is an interesting debate, and I think you're right. There's a kind of a concern around the world about the state of democracy, the threats to democracy, the potential for democratic backsliding or autocratization, and of course, we're not immune from that in Canada. We saw with the Freedom Convoy that there are people who are wanting to disrupt the current system and prepared to operate outside of the constitutional framework of our country. So I think you have to look at how we can strengthen our democracy, how we can make it more robust, how we can deepen it. And I think it is unfortunate that there hasn't been more energy put into strengthening democracy, taking advantage of all of the kinds of participatory innovations that we see around the world that can, in fact, engage citizens and give people more of a sense that they have influence, they have a voice. And one of the things that I think diminishes our satisfaction with democracy is when we feel that we don't have a voice, when we feel that politicians only listen to us at election time. And in particular, there's a sense that our electoral system is part of the problem, that it doesn't give everyone an equal voice. And so this charter challenge came about as a result of a couple of organizations, one Fair Vote BC and Springtide is a voluntary nonprofit, and they decided to take this to the courts and suggest to the courts that they look at whether, in fact, our electoral system is compliant with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees all of us the right to meaningful representation. And they suggest our system doesn't give us meaningful participation in important ways. Now, I don't think anybody is suggesting the courts should change our electoral system. That's something that Canadians need to do. That's something that Canadian parliaments need to do. But the courts could certainly instruct governments to continue to follow through on the promise that, as you mentioned, Justin Trudeau made in 2015 when he said that would be the last election under first past the post. And is so often the case. Politicians advocate for electoral reform when they're in opposition. They see the unfairness of the system. But once they win, and once they get elected, the enthusiasm for electoral reform tends to dissipate. And that's why, it takes pushing through different kinds of means, whether it's through the courts or advocacy, to try to kind of push the agenda forward.
Well, it is one of the idiocies, I think, of this situation is that the people that get elected based on a system they may not agree with are the ones that have to agree to change it. So why would they want to change something that got them into power? I'm reminded that Mike Harris, I think, promised to have a vote on proportional representation, and he stopped that process. Dalton McGuinty promised to have a vote on proportional representation, and then had a referendum and campaigned against it and said mixed member proportional representation was a bad idea, even though he had agreed that he would have a referendum on it. And I think he had agreed that he would run supporting it, but changed his mind in that regard. So maybe we do need a court or someone to come out and say this is bad, because to believe that people that have already been elected are going to agree that what got them elected isn't really the best system seems a little bit illogical, doesn't it?
It does. And that's why, I think referendums can be positive as a means to change the electoral system, but it's also important that they be well designed. We just went through a referendum in BC, actually the third we've had just in living memory on this. And, often these processes are not well designed. They tend to be very adversarial. There's sort of a bias against referendum questions. And, the public really needs to be prepared and engaged. And I think the best example we've had in this country of moving in this direction was the original Citizens Assembly that was held in the province of BC, which engaged a group of ordinary citizens, gave them plenty of opportunity to explore different electoral systems and to make a recommendation. And that actually won. That actually got more than 50% of support of the voters in a referendum. But the government, and again, I think I really question this decision. It set the bar above 50%. You had to get 60% support and then a supermajority of ridings across the province. And even though the support was high, I think it was 58% or something like that, it wasn't quite high enough to change the electoral system. And then we had another referendum, and by that point, people lost interest. And the most recent referendum, I think, was just unfortunately just too rushed, and there wasn't enough of a chance for a meaningful discussion. So there is a push to have a citizens' assembly on electoral reform in Canada. I think that might be a good way to go. I think that actually the Prime Minister and the government started down the right path by putting together a all-party special parliamentary committee to look at electoral reform, and they produced a very solid, very good report that identified a set of principles that we should follow if we're thinking about designing a new electoral system, identified some of the systems that might work well in a country like Canada, and put that forward. And that could be the foundation for a broader public conversation, perhaps a referendum or a citizens' assembly. And it was really the Prime Minister who just said, you know what, forget it. I've lost interest. It wasn't the system that he wanted. The system that he wanted, he subsequently said, was the alternative vote, which is where you indicate not only your first choice, but also what would be your second or third choice in the ballot. And of course, that's going to favor who? The Liberal Party, right? Because, Conservatives are going to prefer their candidates. They're probably going to prefer Liberals to New Democrats or Greens. New Democrats are going to prefer Liberals to Conservatives. And so the Liberals are likely to benefit. It doesn't do anything to address the issue of disproportionality in our system. But that was the Prime Minister's preferred system. And when it didn't go his way, he just decided to walk away from it. And that's the kind of power that our current system gives prime ministers. And that was one of the points I really wanted to make in this opinion piece in the Globe and Mail. We have a system of government that puts extraordinary power in the hands of the prime minister's office, to the detriment, frankly, of our parliamentarians. And our ordinary members of parliament have less and less influence.
I was surprised by that when reading your column, and I want to come back to that after a break if we could and delve into that in greater detail. But before we do that, maybe you could just step back for a second and explain to our listeners, how the first past the post system works and why it is, therefore, that in rural ridings, if you're not a conservative voter, your vote doesn't count, and a lot of people don't feel like they should even bother showing up. And the reciprocal of that, in a lot of urban ridings, a conservative voter doesn't think that his vote counts and doesn't think that he should show up. Can you explain that system to us for a second?
Yeah, sure. There's basically two major types of electoral systems in the world today. One is our system, which is sometimes referred to as first past the post, or it can be called a plurality or majority system. And it's a system in which you have a bunch of ridings. So we've got 338 ridings across the country, and there are elections in each of those ridings, and whoever wins the most votes takes the seat, right? So this is the way that we allocate seats based on how people vote. And so it's a plurality system. You don't have to win more than 50% of the vote. You just have to be the single biggest vote getter in your riding to carry the seat. It's a system that really is designed for a country with two political parties, and it would work fine if you have two political parties. It's very discouraging to third parties. And the reason for that is, as long as you're polling, let's say, at maybe 20% of the vote or 30% of the vote, as long as there's a party that's got more votes than that, you're not going to get any representation. That's why people refer to it as a winner-take-all system. And so let's imagine you have a party that has 20% of support right across the country, but in no seat does it actually have a plurality, because the other parties, one or another of them, always gets more than that 20%, which is highly likely. You're going to get zero representation. Now, if you have some of your voters concentrated in a particular riding, that may help you. So you might have a plurality in one riding, but not another, and so you pick up the seat there. In fact, you might have all of your voters concentrated in one area. And so if you think about the Bloc Québécois, for example, their vote is, of course, concentrated in Quebec. Political scientists refer to this as the efficiency of the distribution of your vote. And so depending on how your vote, how many supporters you have and how they're distributed across the country, it may take more or less voters for you to actually win a majority or a plurality of seats in the legislature. And so this, the primary thing, or primary problem in my view, with this system is what it tends to do is to overrepresent one or two parties. They often form, you can have a majority of seats in the legislature or in the parliament without anything remotely close to a majority of the popular vote. You can win 39, 40, 41% of the popular vote and have a massive majority in the parliament.
Which is the case in Ontario, where we had a 41%, 41 or something like that percent vote for the Conservative Party, but they end up getting a majority even bigger than they had last time.
Right, exactly. And that, sometimes it's the case even that you get the wrong party winning, right? You have the party that, had more votes winning fewer seats and not being able to form government. One of the things that, so this then creates the issue of sort of minority governments that you often get, or rather minority parliaments. You often have parliaments in which nobody has an absolute majority, and then parties actually have to work together. I don't think that's a bad thing. And in fact, we have lots of minority parliaments. We currently have a minority parliament. The last parliament was minority. There wasn't a majority. Trudeau's first election, he won a majority. Harper's had minority as well as majority parliaments. And in fact, what we see in Canada is minority parliaments actually tend to work pretty well. They tend to get things done because they force parties to actually sit down and work together. And where they land on policy issues is often kind of more or less where the country is. They tend to be fairly responsive to the average voter. They tend to be minority governments tend to be particularly attentive to what public opinion is telling them, because they know that their position is a little bit more precarious than when they've got a majority. When they've got people who like our system will say, you get these strong majority governments, they can really get things done. And, I have trouble with that argument, partly because it is kind of autocratic, but also partly because it leads to policy lurch. So you get big changes in policy orientations. Just look at how Canada has handled the environmental file. A lot of lurching back and forth on that issue, compared with European governments, where it's actually quite common in Parliament for parties to work together, to form coalitions even, and to govern together. And then what you tend to do is to get a kind of a consolidation of policy around the center where most voters want it. And you get fewer people who feel completely disenfranchised, because our system creates the wasting of votes. Many people vote for parties that get much less well represented relative to where they stand in the support from the electorate than others. And so that brings me to the other type of system, which is proportional representation. And there are lots of ways of creating electoral systems where, roughly speaking, the proportion of seats in parliament reflects the popular vote.
Well, let's come back to actually how some of those work and could be implemented in the future, because I think that's been a problem as well, is that you've got proportional representation, you've got mixed member proportional, you got this whole confusion about all these different systems that work. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with Dr. Max Cameron, who's written a really interesting article about our first pass of the system being in front of the Superior Court in Ontario, and that it could be good, he thinks, for it to have a judicial review. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I just read a really interesting column in the Globe and Mail by Max Cameron. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. And he wrote an article, opinion piece, "The Charter Challenge of First Past the Post Could Lead to a Better Electoral System." And I found it really quite interesting. And you were touching just before the break on one of the issues in your article that I found really kind of interesting, because I guess I took political science in university, but obviously nothing like your studies of political science, sir. I always thought that the president of the United States was really powerful, elected by people from across the country, direct election, rather than sort of the indirect way that we elect our prime ministers in Canada, and running an executive branch and didn't have to answer to a cabinet that was elected by other ridings. He got to appoint his cabinet himself personally from people in general society, and he was the executive branch. And you, in your article, I think, suggest that the prime minister in Canada and the PMO is even more powerful. And you suggest that Canada, based on international comparisons, has become one of the, I don't know how you described it exactly, but the least accountable to voters governments. Yeah. Explain, please.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point. There are a lot of people look at presidential systems and they think, wow, these create very powerful executives. And presidentialism has been adopted in many countries around the world. Most of the established democracies are actually parliamentary systems. Most of the European democracies are parliamentary systems. And they're the original separation of power systems. When Montesquieu wrote about the separation of powers, his model was the British Constitution and the Westminster system. So we do have a system of separate powers. So we've got an executive, which is the prime minister, and the cabinet, which is accountable to the parliament. And so it has to have the confidence of the parliament in order to function. That's how we form governments, and governments have to retain that confidence if they're going to govern. And that's the critical defense of liberty in our system, right? It is a bulwark against tyranny, that if a prime minister ever tried to get carried away and do things that were illegal, Parliament could end the life of that government very quickly with a vote of non-confidence. You can't do that in a presidential system. So on the one hand, you create a president who concentrates executive power, who's separately elected and has the legitimacy of being the one office that's actually elected by all voters, and yet oftentimes presidents can't get Congress to do what they want. They don't need the support of Congress to hold the office of the president, and Congress can ignore the president without that producing a new election. And so Congress often behaves very irresponsibly. And boy, look at the United States today, and you see exactly all of those pathologies of divided government, even with the Democrats having control over the House and the executive. And of course, the courts are the other element of the separation of powers in both of our systems. So in fact, our system is very efficient, is very powerful. It can become a little bit too powerful, though, if the prime minister's office becomes there's so much power concentrated in the hands of the prime minister's office that ordinary members of parliament are less and less influential, and we see the prime minister's office, because it controls cabinet appointments, because it controls committees, because it controls perks that members of parliament want. There are possibilities of rising in the system. The prime minister's office is extraordinarily powerful. But just think of the fact that we've got a prime minister. I don't know, but it strikes me as remarkable that he's had 3 elections, and it looks like he wants to go into a 4th election. And nobody in the Liberal Party seems to be in a position to say, hang on, Mr. Prime Minister, you've had your chance. Why not step aside and let somebody else have an opportunity? And it's just because they're all beholden to the prime minister's office. There's just so much power there. And I think that is distinct. Our system is peculiar in the degree to which our parliament is weak relative to the prime minister.
Do you have prime minister's office in Downing Street or in Australia or somewhere that are similarly as powerful, or is our PMO unique in its powerfulness?
I think it is unique. It is, or rather, not unique, but it is extreme. So, for example, in the British Parliament, you've got a much larger parliament, and there are lots and lots and lots of backbenchers. Many of those backbenchers don't anticipate that they will ever be in cabinet. And so they tend to be more willing to challenge their party leaders. And they do, right? And they can bring down prime ministers, and they do on a fairly regular basis. And so, in fact, even the Westminster system is one in which I think Parliament has a larger role. Now, the best way to enhance the role of Parliament is to make sure that the prime minister has to work across party lines to get things done. And most parliamentary systems, I mean, there's really only of the established, older democracies in the world, they're almost all PR parliamentary systems. And what tends to happen there is that parties learn to cooperate and work together. And that's actually what makes our parliamentary system most efficient in terms of policy, is that capacity for working together. Our system isn't based on checks and balances. It's not so much based on the idea that you create these separately elected branches, and then you make sure that the president can veto legislation and make sure that the Congress can impeach the president, and you set up conflicts, right? Our system isn't so much based on conflict as it is on cooperation, but that cooperation should be on a much more even footing than it is. And if you had a PR system, I think that's more likely to be the case.
This case that's going forth to the Superior Court in Ontario, you're saying that, and I'll quote your article, in assessing the constitutionality of first past the post, the court should consider how our electoral system, combined with the historically recent rise in the dominance of the PMO, has altered the functioning of the separation of powers in ways that weaken our democracy. The court could signal to government the need to convene an arm's-length citizens' assembly to recommend a new electoral system aimed at restoring a better balance among the branches of government. Do you think this is actually the role of a court to what? To say our system's not working, you got to come up with a better one?
Well, it's interesting. I don't think we've really confronted this kind of problem much in our past, because our democracy has been, a pretty robust one, pretty stable. We are fortunate. If we look around the world, we're fortunate to have a system that works, pretty well. The concentration of power in the hands of the prime minister's office really is something that's happened in the last 50 years. And frankly, it started under Pierre Trudeau. And
wasn't wasn't the first Trudeau the one that said something like, a member of parliament is a nobody 1 mile from Parliament Hill?
Exactly.
Or was
that's
it
exactly
1 kilometer?
right?
I can't remember.
Yeah. It may have been before we switched over, but that's exactly right. And I think that that's unfortunate, right? That we tend to think about members of parliament as being nobodies, as uninfluential, and we've kind of presidentialized our system. We put so much emphasis on the personality of the leader, and so much power has been concentrated there because, in part, governments worry that if parliamentarians are given too much autonomy, they're going to say crazy things and get the government into trouble. And so there's a lot of discipline and message control that goes into governing and trying to prevent missteps from happening. So, but what the other side of that is, then you can't get anything done without the prime minister's concurrence. And so a lot of stuff just doesn't happen because it's not a priority for the PMO.
Max, is this a natural outgrowth of the system, or is it just a unique set of circumstances because of the individual? And let me give you my thesis for a second, if I could. I'm not a politician like you are, or a political scientist, but I've been involved in business, and there are leaders in business that run the show 100% themselves, and there's leaders in business that really have a team approach to running business. I think one of the keys to success in a lot of our most successful prime ministers in the past have been that they've been they've been made up of cabinets that have been strong. I think about Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. I think about Pierre Trudeau, John Turner, and numerous others. Marc Lalonde, et cetera. That you would remember. I even think of Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty. I really worry that our current Prime Minister has not allowed other people to take a very senior role. Maybe Chrystia Freeland being the one and only, and some of the articles that have come out this past little while about our former Minister of Defense that has been shuffled out of defense into the dead end Treasury Board situation as a way of taking her out of the limelight. So is this a cause of the personality traits of the leader, or is this a cause of the system that we've created?
That's a difficult question, and I think it may vary, it may depend, and it may be both. Certainly there does seem to be a tendency over time for, and this actually goes back to the 19th century in some sense, right? Because it's partly a function of the changing nature of the political party. Our system was originally designed before political parties really emerged to be the kind of the central focus of public policy decision making. And then, of course, we had this growing strength of cabinet, and then even the prime minister more than cabinet. And so over time, there seems to have been this sort of shift in power away from Parliament and into the hands of the Prime Minister, and around the Prime Minister, all of the unelected, appointed officials and experts. We talk about the proverbial sort of kids in short pants who kind of boss around parliamentarians, tell them what they can say and what they can do and so forth, and send out the signals about what the Prime Minister wants. And personalities may also play a role. Certainly, I mean, if you read what Jody Wilson-Raybould has said about how she was treated by the Prime Minister, it's pretty striking the degree to which the Prime Minister feels that he can tell the Attorney General what to do, the Minister of Justice what to do in a particular case that's in her area of competence, and she was simply insisting that we allow the judicial process to unfold as it normally would. And he kind of resisted that for political reasons.
Can I stop you on that for a second?
Yeah.
I got to ask you on that one. We have had some blowback from that situation, but I think about, all the comments about Donald Trump telling his Attorney General what to do, or the comments recently about weaponizing the Justice, the Department of Justice, etc. We just don't seem to have had an equivalent kind of rising up of disgust at prime ministerial influence on the Department of Justice or the Attorney General in Canada, when we look at the United States and we're shocked by what Donald Trump tried to do.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it's really interesting. Whatever you may think about Jody Wilson-Raybould's position, she was adhering to the principle, right? That the Attorney General's office is independent and has to uphold the laws, right? And that's, again, when we think about the role of the courts here, I think the courts do need to look at these kinds of things and say, is there a risk that we have created an executive office, the Prime Minister's office, which is able to act in defiance of these basic constitutional principles? I don't think that we've seen anything remotely as bad as Donald Trump's, bullying of election officials and trying to really literally overturn the constitutional order. But I think all of our democracies in the established democratic world, and even more so beyond it, if you look at other places, Brazil, and I'm currently in Peru at the moment, right? And we see a real tendency for executive power to be concentrated, and for executives to want to aggrandize themselves and to encroach on other branches of government, often because they think they've got a mandate to do it, or they think that the public will support them. And so I think it's pretty important for us as citizens, as the people who are interested in the state of our democracy, to sort of, to speak up and call that out when we see it.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Dr. Max Cameron, political science professor at University of British Columbia, who's written an article, a column on on a current court case that is taking a look at our electoral system. And we're going to delve into proportional representation and some of the alternatives. So we've focused now on what's wrong. We've focused on the first past the post, and now I want to turn to, is there an alternative? And is there an alternative that works? Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight with a professor of political science from UBC. His name is Dr. Maxwell Cameron. He's not only in the Department of Political Science, but also the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. And he's written a column, an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail called "The Charter Challenge of First Past the Post Could Lead to a Better Electoral System." So I got to ask you, sir, what's the better electoral system? I've had people on, I had Tony Clement on, a former cabinet minister in Ontario, former cabinet minister in Ottawa, very experienced politician. He actually was a councillor at the city of Toronto. So he's been municipal, provincial, federal. He knows his politics well. He's someone I met, in politics, political science at University of Toronto, decades and decades ago. And he went, "Oh, yeah, Brian, so we want a system that works just as well as Italy and Israel," which is a response you get from a lot of people. They take a look at proportional representation systems and think they're dysfunctional. So tell me, what's your better system?
That's such a canard, and you hear it again and again and again. Nobody is proposing the Israeli electoral system for Canada. Nobody, right? So that's just not on the table, right? The problem with I'll get into in a minute into the problem with the Israeli system after I describe PR systems in general. I think you could, make a list of electoral systems and put it on a piece of paper and throw a dart at it, and you'd almost certainly hit a better system than ours. So I think the first past the post system is deeply flawed, but there's no consensus that there is one system that's best for all countries. And to some degree, the first past the post is what we're familiar with, so it has that going for it. It does have there are some elements that are positive. It creates governments where the mandate to act is pretty clear. It's pretty clear who's supported you and who's responsible and who's accountable. So it has some features that are advantageous, but it does have this problem that it creates a wildly disproportionate distribution of seats relative to the distribution of the vote. So the solution is, instead of having one member of parliament for each riding, you create ridings in which there are multiple members, and that gives you the chance to make sure that there's a somewhat closer approximation between who gets a seat and what the vote distribution is. So the system I personally would favor would be a mixed system where you would still have ridings that elect their members as individuals, but you would also have lists that you could vote for. So you'd have two votes, actually. We give what could be more democratic? We're going to give you two votes, not just one. So the one vote is for one member of parliament in your riding, but then you'd have another vote for a party, right? And then you look at how many people support different parties, and based on that, you'd allocate seats to that multi-member riding. And these lists can be done in a variety of different ways. You can have them open, so people not only choose the list, that is the party that they support, but they could choose the individual member that they think they would like to represent them. Or it can be a closed list. You just vote for the party and you let the parties select who those members will be, which is actually, frankly, our system's the closest system, right? We don't as voters get to choose, who the party puts forward as the candidate in the riding. We just choose the candidate in the riding. So you would have two votes, and one of those would allow us to allocate seats in a way that's more proportional. The Israeli system is a crazy system because you've got one district for the whole country, and then you've got a threshold that's set very low. So basically any party that gets more than 1.5% of the vote can get some kind of representation. That leads to massive fragmentation of the vote. And then you get the dysfunction in Israel isn't due to the electoral system itself, it's actually due to the fragmentation of the party system. We could easily create a system in Canada that would be more proportional, but it wouldn't lead to that kind of fragmentation. The chances are that if we had something like the New Zealand system, which is a mixed member proportional system, we'd get maybe one or two more parties than we currently have. And certainly the smaller parties that we have, so that would be parties like the NDP, the Greens, the People's Party, they would be better represented. And to the degree that, smaller parties then have better representation, you create an incentive for those parties to grow or for new parties to emerge. So there would probably be more parties, but you wouldn't get the kind of fragmentation that you see in Israel, because that's the product of all kinds of other things. And I think it's important to remember the electoral system is just one component of our political systems. One of the factors that decides how many parties we have and how they function and how elections are fought and so forth, but it's only one.
So let's talk about some of these different issues piece by piece. Having a few more parties, I actually think is a real positive. And the example that I've used is the trucker convoy. I think that one of the real issues that we had with the trucker convoy is there were a certain segment of society that didn't feel like they were being listened to and wanted their voices to be heard, and they weren't being heard. And I think the prime minister made some mistake in that regard in not listening to them. He didn't have to agree to them, but he should have at least listened to them. And so therefore they took sort of things into their own hand and went and occupied Ottawa. The People's Party won, I think it was 6% of the popular vote. And so therefore, under proportional representation, they would have had a few seats. Maxime Bernier would have had a seat in Parliament. And if Maxime Bernier had a seat in Parliament and was able to argue those points that the trucker convoy were arguing for in Parliament, and yet still got defeated and turned down, at least they wouldn't have been able to say, we're not being listened to, we're not being heard. And so I do think that there is a real benefit in having, minority, even really small minority voices at least listened to and heard, and having their day in the sun.
I completely agree with you. And I actually think that, in fact, the electoral system played a pretty fundamental role in that whole episode. And the reason I say that is part of what motivated Trudeau in calling that last election was he desperately wanted a majority. And that's what happens in our system is the aspiration. You don't need 50% of the vote to get a majority. You just need to cross that threshold of about 42% of the vote, and you've got a majority. And he hankered after that. So he called an election that we didn't need and nobody wanted. And then he had to figure out, well, what was the reason for calling it? How do I persuade people that we have to have this election? And he used the vaccine mandate as a wedge issue, as an issue that he could run with in that election, because he knew his base would support it, and it would divide the Conservatives. And it did exactly what he intended. It did create division within the Conservatives, and he didn't get any new seats, really. I mean, it's virtually the same parliament, which could have been predicted. So it wasn't successful in that sense, but it did create a huge problem for the Conservative Party. Then you get, as a result of this pressure, this politicizing of the whole mandate issue, you get the eruption of this protest, which has as you say, no way to express itself in politics. And so then the leader of the Conservative Party is removed in a very peremptory way, and we get the emergence of Pierre Poilievre, who has been pandering to the kind of politics that we saw with the truckers' convoy. This is terrible. I mean, this is just not how to run a country, and an electoral system is a big part of this. I think you're exactly right that if we had better representation of the spectrum of opinions that we have in our society, you probably would get a voice for people like the truckers' convoy and for sort of far right people. By the way, I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with having people on the far right of the political system represented in your system, as long as they support democracy, right? I think the problem is when you have extremists who are anti-democratic and want to bring down the system, right? And so it's fine to have good, robust, and representation of maybe multiple parties on the right, multiple parties on the left. The other thing is our system doesn't do a very good job of representing minorities and women. And so one of the reasonable hopes that would come about from electoral reform would be to see a parliament that actually looks more like our society in terms of reflecting its diversity and its pluralism. So there are lots of ways in which our parliament itself could be made more democratic by having a better electoral system.
I think there's another issue that we haven't talked about, which is sort of the minority positions that the majority or the plurality has in other regions. And maybe that's not the right way to describe it, but there are liberals in Alberta. and there are conservatives in downtown Toronto and downtown Vancouver. And I think that, you know, the liberals in Alberta don't get represented, and so therefore the Liberal government doesn't have the benefit, and Alberta doesn't have the benefit of having some Liberal representation in cabinet or in the caucus, the Liberal caucus, because even though, you know, there is a sizable, albeit not a plurality of Liberals that vote in Alberta for the Liberal Party, they don't have any seats. And then similarly, there are some conservatives that just aren't in rural places and suburban places. There are some conservatives in downtown Toronto. There are some conservatives in downtown Montreal and downtown Vancouver, and they similarly don't get represented. And so therefore the urban voice doesn't get heard and voted on in the Conservative caucus. And so I do think that we've got a problem where our political parties aren't as robust as they could and should be, because we've robbed ourselves of the minority representation that the plurality might have in other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so paradoxical to me that we hear advocates of first past the post saying, well, you know, big federal countries like Canada need this kind of system because it creates, you know, strong central government. Are you crazy? I mean, look at Quebec. Look at the overrepresentation of separatism in Quebec, because that's where their vote is concentrated. Look at the absence of liberal representation in the West. So I want to see conservatives from Quebec, and I want to see, in Toronto, the full range of views there, and Vancouver and so forth. And we could do much, much better in terms of creating a system that really genuinely reflects us in all of our diversity. Let's not be so afraid of our diversity. Let's welcome it as part of our strength. And then let's create parliaments where politicians have a job to do, which is to work together, figure out how to get things done across party lines, in spite of the, you know, none of the differences that we have in our country, rural, urban, West versus the center, Quebec, multiculturalism, none of those problems are insuperable. We're actually really good as a country at navigating that pluralism. But if you look at our parliament, it doesn't seem to reflect our ability to do that, and it doesn't model it for us. And I think that's what we desperately need to see, is a parliament that's far more functional and far more inspiring in terms of the way that we as Canadians govern ourselves.
Okay, so how would you get the Quebec to agree to such change? Because the Bloc Québécois, as you point out, would diminish in its influence and its number of seats fairly dramatically. I think the Bloc Québécois, polls in less than 10% of the public opinion nationally, but gets 25 to 35% in Quebec, and wins a whole bunch of seats in Quebec that they wouldn't get in a proportional representation system.
Yeah, so that's why these decisions, in some sense, have to be taken out of the hands of elected officials, of parliamentarians, because they have a stake. They have skin in the game. They're never going to change it unless there's pressure to change it. And that pressure has to come from, I think maybe it could come in this case from the courts, but fundamentally from public opinion. And if you say, okay, this is an issue that's too important to be left to the politicians, let's put it back in the hands of the people and design an appropriate process for engaging people. I think what you would find is that there are a lot of people in Quebec, there are a lot of people across the country who would welcome a change in our electoral system. And frankly, again, if you go back to that committee that was tasked with looking into ways in which we could improve our electoral system, there was representation there of the Bloc, and I think there are people who are very reasonable, very democratic within the Bloc. Say what you want about Quebec separatists. They're democratic. They're deeply committed to democracy. They're as democratic as anybody in our country, and so the argument has to be a democratic one. It has to be an argument about strengthening citizenship and engagement with our process, and creating a system of government in which there is collaboration. I'm not actually sure that at the end of the day, this is something that either conservatives or Quebec voters or even separatists need to sort of worry about. I think improving the way our system functions is actually good for everyone.
So when former Premier Dalton McGuinty opposed the mixed member proportional referendum, one of his big arguments is that it would necessitate twice as many members of provincial parliament, and that we don't want that many politicians, was one of his lines. How does your system work? Would it mean twice as many politicians?
Yeah, it's such an interesting problem because there's a kind of animus in the public against it is part of the sort of, the times that we're living. People don't particularly trust our politicians these days, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the functioning of our institutions. And so when you say, well, let's have more members of parliament, a lot of people resist that. Doesn't that mean more money? Isn't that going to be more expensive? You think of the amount of money it costs to run a parliament in relation to the size of the budgets these organizations in principle control. It's minuscule. This is a good investment. I actually am in favor of expanding the size of our legislatures. I would make that case both provincially and in the case of BC, where I live, but federally as well. I don't think that there's anything wrong. In fact, a bigger legislature means better representation for communities. You don't need to, and typically our ridings have roughly 100,000 people per member of parliament. If you expand the size of parliament, then you have more people, more parliamentarians representing the same number of constituents. It's actually better representation. I think the direct connection that people have with their member of parliament is an important value to retain. And that's why I wouldn't favor a pure PR system. I think we should keep ridings and keep them as small as possible. And if we have to expand the number of parliamentarians in order to do that, I think that that's a trade-off well worth making. And again, as I said, a larger parliament means more people are not going to get into cabinet. More people are going to be backbenchers, and they're going to focus on their job as ordinary members of parliament, and legislating, holding government accountable, doing budget estimates, doing committee work, all of the stuff that parliamentarians are supposed to be doing, which increasingly they don't really do because they're basically told what to do by the party brass, and they follow orders, right? And we need to get away from that. So I'm all for bigger parliaments.
We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes with some concluding comments from our guest, Dr. Max Cameron from UBC, talking about the first past the post system. And I'm going to focus on this court challenge and what actually could happen. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Maxwell Cameron. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. He's written a really interesting opinion piece in the Globe and Mail called "The Charter Challenge of First Past the Post Could Lead to a Better Electoral System." Max, we focused on first past the post. We focused on proportional representation. We've talked about the power of the PMO. We've talked about the lack of power of the local member of parliament. Now let's talk about the actual process here of this Superior Court challenge. I never knew that a court could actually have a role in this, and I wonder what do you think the court's going to do, and what could it do?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to say that I'm not in any way part of this challenge. I was invited by a friend who is interested in this issue to write the piece in the Globe and Mail, but I'm not involved in it. I haven't presented to any kind of brief to the court or anything of that sort. But I'm interested, and I'll watch it closely because I have for a long time been an advocate for PR, and I think it's interesting that in our country, where we now have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, courts can look at legislation and say, does this meet the test of the Charter? And so the argument's being made, it doesn't, that we're not well represented, and particularly we don't represent well people who would cluster around smaller parties. We're not representing women and minorities. Our parliaments are not as diverse as they could be. A lot of votes are wasted. A lot of people don't really ever have a chance to have a voice in parliament effectively because their votes are sort of canceled by the way that the system works. So that's the challenge. I don't know whether it'll be successful or what'll come out of it. My hope in writing the op-ed, my hope was really just to say, look, this could be a chance for the courts to say, we do have, first of all, the electoral system isn't in our Constitution. It's a piece of legislation. It's in our Elections Act. I mean, a changing of the Elections Act is ordinary legislation. It's not a constitutional problem. However, it is obviously a really important piece of our political system, and it's important to retain public trust in it. And any changes would have to be done in a way that is fair, is nonpartisan, reflects the will of the people. I mean, that's absolutely critical. The courts are not going to change our electoral system. They're not going to decide what our electoral system should be. Nobody should worry about that. The most the courts would do, I think, again, I'm not an expert in this, but my sense is that the courts could say, there's something problematic about our system vis-a-vis the charter, and government should address this. And then it would be up to government in particular, but it would be, I think, ideally, the best route would be for government to say, we acknowledge this is an important question. We really think that it's up to the people to decide. There are all kinds of creative ways of tapping into what the people would like, particularly if they have the chance to look at the issue, consider the alternatives, to deliberate collectively and to arrive at a solid judgment, right, where the public can get behind what we've decided. And so that's where a citizens' assembly could be a good option, but it's not the only option. So I think at best what will happen is a signal back to the legislative process that this is an issue that needs to be addressed.
You know, I'm not sure if this analogy makes any sense to you or not, but I'm going to try it on you anyway. When I first heard about this court challenge, I thought, well, yeah, it's crazy. It's not going to have any impact. And then I read this indictment of Donald Trump in the United States, and that one of the indictments is actually that he was taking away people's right to vote, or was trying to take away their right to vote. And when you actually read what the indictment is, it's pretty compelling that people have a right under the U.S. Constitution to vote, and he was taking it away. So I started wondering, is there an analogy here that the first past the post, the way that you're describing it, is taking away people's rights the same way, maybe not through a tampering with election results, but similar to what Donald Trump was doing in the United States by taking away votes. Is there any analogy there?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy that really stands out for me is to the way in which the incredibly undemocratic nature of the American electoral system, the gerrymandering of districts, the electoral college, the incredible lack of proportionality in terms of representation in the Senate to the different states. You get tiny little states with just a handful of people living in them, having the same representation of massive states with millions and millions of people. It's very disproportionate. And what happens is politicians game this stuff, right? They understand this. They know this, and they figure out ways. Now, Trump is actually, a genius at this, at figuring out ways of gaming the system. He wants to be able to control the government with a minority. He wants minority rule. That's ultimately what I think Trump is after. And he'll do it through the courts. He'll do it through gerrymandering. He'll do it through controlling of the Senate, the filibuster in the Senate.
So I've agreed with what a lot of what you've said today, sir. I disagree with this completely. Donald Trump does not want minority rule. He wants one person rule.
Well, and he's an autocrat. Yeah, I mean, there's a case to be made that if he gets a chance to run again, he'll overturn the Constitution and he'll install himself as an autocrat. I don't know. I think that's far-fetched. I think it's because I think he actually represents something deeper, which is a white population, Christian population, that fears becoming a minority in their own country, and they use Trump as much as he uses them. So that's really what I mean by minority rule is the hanging on to power of people who have traditionally held power in that country in the face of change, in the face of more multiculturalism, more immigrants, and so forth. And so then the analogy to Canada is we have an old electoral system that sort of made maybe sense back in the 19th century. Doesn't really make sense in our country today. Nobody has imposed this on us. Nobody has rammed it down our throats. We've just kind of inherited it. And can we change it and make it better in order to prevent ourselves from getting into a situation where we really see our institutions becoming less and less functional, less and less engaging, less and less inspiring?
Well, I look forward to seeing what happens with this court case, and I hope you report back to us on it. And it sounds like we could have a really interesting conversation on minority rule / autocratization in the United States. And I got to tell you, I've been a long supporter of not only proportional representation, but mandatory voting, recall, and referendum. And so sounds like we could have lots of great conversations. But
Wonderful.
Dr. Max Cameron, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us a little bit about this current fight in the Superior Court of Ontario on first past the post. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure. Anytime.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from British Columbia or Chile. Is it Chile or Peru? Peru, I apologize. At www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everyone. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Ryan.